I'm really happy to be able to welcome you all to this event today with Ted Schatzki, who came to us all the way from Kentucky to visit the Sonderforschungsbereich, Collaborative Research Center, Practices of Preparing. We're really glad to have you, finally. As we discussed on Monday, when we met for the first time this week, I think the first email that I sent you to invite you to come to Bielefeld was 2016. So it took some time. There was a pandemic and other problems in between. This makes me even more happy to have you finally visit us. And then when I picked you up at the ZIP and we walked down to the X building over campus, you told me that you've been here before as a Alexander von Humboldt fellow 30 years ago, living in the EBZ, which is now quite empty, as if I see that correctly. So there's lots of change happening in between the times that you visited Bielefeld. What we do today is we are going to have a roundtable discussion about one of your latest books, Social Change in a Material World, which appeared in 2019. And we prepared some questions, and I will make a short introduction of the people that you can see sitting here with me, and also on the big screen behind me somewhere, Tobias Werron. So maybe a few words about Ted Schatzki. He's a professor for geography and philosophy and sociology at the College of Arts and Sciences at Kentucky University. And he also holds a position at Lancaster University in the Department of Sociology. Yes. And on his website, his research interests are listed as theory of social life, contemporary social and critical theory, 19th and 20th century continental philosophy. And as many of you have learned over the past 3 days that Ted has been here to discuss with us, there are many more than just those three fields of interest. He's also former Senior Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, former chair of the Department of Philosophy, all these posts that most professors kind of go through in the turn of their careers. But you also oversaw a multidisciplinary graduate level teaching and research program in social thought. And I think that especially the PhD students that were present at the research class on Tuesday learned that you really are engaging with especially young researchers for the last decades, basically, and that we also profited from that experience when you discussed with our PhD students. Ted earned a degree in applied mathematics from Harvard University in 1977, and then went on to study philosophy in Oxford, got a degree from Oxford and the University of California in Berkeley. Your interests lie in theorizing social life, and you are, and this is again a quote from the website, he is widely associated with a stream of thought called practice theory. And this is basically the core reason why we invited you in the first place, because of course our research center on practices of comparing is all about practice theory, at least methodologically. And we're really happy to have you here to discuss this with us. I'm not going to name all the publications that relate to either the wide stream of thought called practice theory or other research interests that you published over the years. But one of the most important for us, or maybe the reason for us sitting here today, is that book that I've mentioned already, Social Change in a Material World, which I believe relates to many questions of our research group here in Bielefeld. And I was particularly interested, and Thomas Müller, who I'm mentioning here now because he's basically the co-organizer, at least, of this event and this week with Ted Schatzki here in Bielefeld, pointed out to me a sentence that I'm going to quote again. So I was particularly interested in the empirical examples used in your book, which are, and I quote, the history of bourbon distillation in the state of Kentucky, where I reside, well, this is Ted residing, and the formation and evolution of associations of old and new kinds via contemporary digital media. And this is particularly interesting to me, and it's not because of the bourbon, sadly. Now, in preparing this event, we prepared 2 questions for everyone on the panel to answer, except me. The first one is, and I quote, significant difference a productive way of conceptualizing change? This is one term that you used in your book. To what extent does it differ from the ways you think about change? And second, how useful do you find, and this goes particularly to the non-Schatzki people, Ted Schatzki's explanation of change in terms of interplay between chains of actions on the one hand and material events and processes on the other hand. And besides Ted, we have 3 colleagues in total who are going to answer or reply or comment on these questions and points that we made. The first who's going to speak to us after Ted is Cornelia Aust. She's a early modern historian specializing in Jewish history of the early modern times, as well as the 19th century in Middle and Eastern European regions. And she's a research associate, I think maybe is the right term. She works in one of our sub-projects of the Collaborative Research Center, Order in Diversity, the Compared Body, 16th to 19th centuries, focusing on these questions. And then we have Elisa Ronzheimer. She's a literary scholar working here at the literary department at Bielefeld University. She's leading one of the sub-projects that we have in our Collaborative Research Center on comparative reading, the Constitution and critique of stilistics as a literary method. Mm-hmm. And then we have Tobias Werron on the screen, there we go. He's a professor for sociological theory and allgemeine Soziologie. General sociology is not really a good translation. At Bielefeld University, and he focuses in his research on historical sociological topics, especially competition. Is that concurrence? Competition?
Yes.
Nationalism and globalization. And he's associated with the SFB, leading a project, how rankings are made on the social production of serial comparisons. So this is the panel. I myself, I'm Silke Schwandt. I'm heading the sub-project on digital humanities and data infrastructure, as well as a project on comparative practices in early medieval law in England. And I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm really glad, Ted, to hand over to you with your comments on your own work.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks. And thanks to all of you for being here. And thanks for inviting me. Indeed, it's been 7 years since the first contact was for an event, I believe that was pre-SFB. But anyway, so I'm really happy to be able, you picked out 2 theses from the book, and I thought it might be useful to say a few words about where they come from. And I'm actually going to say nothing about practice theory because they come from elsewhere and then intersect with practice theory in the course of the book. So I want to first say that, so I'm a philosopher by training and was in a philosophy department for a long time. And when asked what I do in an academic context, I always say I'm a philosophical social theorist. So that means it's social theory done in a way sensitive to philosophical issues. And I say that because the 2 theses that you have picked out to be commented on are both, I think, philosophical. And so what I'm going to say amounts to then some of the philosophical motivation for these ideas. And so it's not really practice theory, since practice theory, I don't think it has a philosophical background, but not philosophical motivation. So I was thinking, what is the metaphysical premise or starting point behind what I say about change in events and processes? And I realized I'm not sure, and I'm still not sure. And I thought at first maybe I would say something like, the world is not static. But then I thought that's too close to the topic of change already. And so that wouldn't serve as a good starting point. So then I thought more. So I thought the starting point is simply the idea that things happen, comma, in time. So that's just the starting, the conviction that things happen. So, philosophically, it's like it has a similar sort of generality to the issue of why is there something rather than nothing. So it's a similarity. Things happen. And what happens lays down the course of the world. And that is laid down by the events and processes as they happen. And let me just say a word about events and processes. There's a lot of philosophical analysis of these categories. I think of them as distinct categories, and that one wants to keep them apart. Events are simply things happening, whatever that means. I think we all have an intuitive grasp of that, but actually in social theory, there's surprisingly little analysis of that. On the other hand, processing is a concept that there are alternative social theoretical conceptions of process. Just to give you an example, I think at one end of the spectrum, there are like Tony Abbott sequences of events, which makes processes very close to events. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have Bergson, where a process is like the ongoing unfolding of something in its unfolding. And so process becomes the leading edge of the happening of the universe in Bergson's hands. So I'm not going to worry about, there are all these different notions of process one can use. And note that events and processes are temporal entities. They take place in, and most of them, over time. So I'll come back, the significance of that, I'll come back to in a moment. Now, the philosophical, there's a philosophical idea here, which is that events and processes leave behind differences. So if I put my hand up like this, there is a difference between the state of the world having done that and the state of the world prior to that. So a difference has been added. And if you all then wonder, why is he using such a silly example or something? That introduces new differences with what had happened before. And of course, not just what was immediately before, but everything that was before. So differences are constantly being produced by processes and events. And some people say difference is change, or it's the other way around. Change is difference. And so that those myriad of differences that are constantly being added to the inventory of the world as events and processes take place. Someone can say those are all instances of change. Now, the people who say this tend to emphasize notions of flow and becoming when thinking about the nature of reality or the nature of social life. I wouldn't say process or process theorists, but there are prominent people who, like Gilles Deleuze would be a good example of this. And people who think this way conclude that change is omnipresent, right? Because difference is constantly being produced. Change is omnipresent. Now, there's some issues with this view. I'll just mention a couple. One is Heraclitus's paradoxes, which is a genuine kind of issue. If change is omnipresent, there is no persistence. And that eventually leads you into the thesis you can't step in the same river twice, which then on further reflection makes you realize you can't step in the same river once. And this is, to me, not a good, to land in paradox is not a good, but the other argument pertains now more to social theory. It's that change, process, event are all temporal notions. So is persistence. Persistence is the continuation of the same over time. So take the University of Bielefeld. It persists. That is, there continues to be the University of Bielefeld over time, from 1 second to the next, over decades, for now, 50 years or so. And so persistence happens over time too. So both change and persistence exist through this cascade of differences that are being produced by events and processes. So, and those of you, many of you will be familiar with Derrida's. When Derrida wants to talk about identity, he speaks of sameness over difference. And that's a way of thinking he's picked up from Heidegger. It originates eventually in the sophist of Plato's, is to think that differences are somehow constitutive of reality. So that means both persistence and change have to involve the occurrence of difference. And so difference can't be changed then, because persistence also involves difference. And this leads to the idea that only certain differences and certain accumulations and aggregations of difference can qualify as change. And then the question is, well, which ones? And here we can imagine various theses, but this yields the idea that significant difference is change. And so take the University of Bielefeld. There are constantly things going on here, right? People are teaching classes, people are entering and exiting the building, computers are breaking down. We can make this incredibly long inventory. And we might say that, you know, the University of Bielefeld hasn't really changed much at all, even as all these differences occur. But if building X is constructed, or if a medical faculty is added, we might say change has occurred. The university has changed. And these are significant differences. And so for me, I want to think of significant differences as change, where significance depends on three things. And one of them is the actual differences that occur. University changing by virtue of a medical faculty being built presumes that the faculty has been built. So there is the actual differences. But then, and this now speaks to, that was ontology, the more epistemological side. It also depends on with what particular differences or accumulations of difference are, what they are juxtaposed with. And then also the judgment of whomever is gegenüber this, whoever is, I don't want to use the word observe, but whoever is taking this in, whoever is appreciating it. And so in my mind, I would say that's the relevant, as a good Wittgensteinian, it's the relevance of context. So significance lies in this confluence of what actually happens and the context in which it is apprehended. So that's where that thesis comes from. And I'll be quicker with the second thesis, which is chains of activity and material causality. So I have a phenomenological background. And the phenomenology that I learned thought of phenomenology, or as it's a form of modern empiricism. That is the idea that experience gives us access to reality. And experience gives us access to social reality. For instance, all of our experience is right now giving us access to the social reality that's transpiring in this room. Where I think of social reality as connected to human coexistence. And there's a footnote here. There's also a discussion to be had about non-humans in this context. But for the moment, we'll just take it as human coexistence. We are given access to this. And then the second, that's one philosophical premise. The second philosophical premise is an analysis of causality that I learned from Heidegger, who appropriates it from Aristotle. And that's the idea that one thing is the cause of another if it is responsible for it. So wherever we are tempted to attribute responsibility for something to another thing, we are attributing causality. So there's a great deal of things being responsible. So if I pick this up and drink some water, I have caused the glass to move. In the sense that I am responsible for the glass having moved and tipped its angle. Okay, so let's combine these two ideas now. And what we get is that what kinds of things being responsible for other things do I have access to through my experience that pertain to human coexistence? Well, one thing is we experience people intervening in the world and changing it. That we do this all the time. We are constantly altering the world about us through our interventions into the world. At the same time, we are constantly reacting to things. Those things are leading to our actions. And if you put those two ideas together of reacting to something, enacting, intervening in the world, to which then someone else reacts, either to what I do or to the change in the world, and then someone else reacts to what they do or to the change that they intervene in the world, you have the idea of a chain of actions. And so we are given access to that, what I would call a causal thread, type of causal thread that meanders through this reality that we have access to in our experience. And then there's a variety of material causalities. That is, material things being responsible for other material things. So if it rains really hard, puddles form. The rain is responsible, together with the angles and the surface form of the hard, impermeable surfaces and so forth, is responsible for the formation of the puddles. So that's a causality. Or if there's an earthquake and the earth shakes and maybe a few things fall down, there's an instance where a material event is responsible. Or if I'm writing with a pen and it leaks, the ink might stain my fingers, right? And so that's a material event being responsible for another material state of affairs. So there's a whole variety of material causalities. And there's a lot of this. There are people, wherever there's social life, there are people intervening in the world, reacting to what other people are doing into states of the world. There is material things being responsible for other material things. This is a very complex complex. And so the claim here is that ultimately, and I stress the word ultimately because this is a philosophical reason, the kinds of being responsible for, what is responsible for the states of the social world ultimately come back to combinations of the activity chains and the material causalities, this being what is given to us in the reality we have access to through our experience. Now, ultimately is what philosophers like to talk about, but ultimately is not really very useful either in everyday life or when you're studying the social world. So what part of the art of studying society is learning to give Übersichten, overviews of complex states of intertwined activity chains in material causalities, using terms that maybe come from everyday life or technical terms that social investigators like to, and so to give. And so people are constantly trying to give overviews. So here's some examples of the sorts of concepts people use then to give a causal account of the world. And so concepts like accumulation, bifurcation, interweaving, contagion, dependence, codependence, coevolution, power, feedback loops, cascades, exchanges, governance, collective agency, evolution, transformation, development. These are all concepts with which someone can give an Übersicht over this complex nexus of causal processes, and thereby there's no issue of actually enumerating, because not only is that impossible, but it would yield no understanding. But we learn to acquire an understanding at a distance, so to speak, that is a way which captures, characterizes somehow the complexity, the gist, the essence of it, conveys something, and is able to communicate that to others. And there's a strong communicative dimension then to the doing of science, which involves the formulation and exchange of ideas with colleagues. So anyways, that's where that second thesis comes from.
Thank you so much for leading us also with that sort of bridge of interacting with colleagues. So, Connie, you want to go first as the historian on the panel?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, thank you for inviting me, being on the panel, and also it was a great opportunity to read your book, and I enjoyed reading it and trying to do what I try to do, neither being a philosopher nor a sociologist. I try to think through it with case studies that I'm working on as a historian, and particularly as an early modern historian, which I think makes an additional difference. So on the first question about significant difference, or what I kind of read as a chain or a stage of what you introduced as, and just explained again, as difference or micro difference that happens basically with every practice or every act or every, and also where we see changes in practices or context or the material conditions, but no great like change or social meaning of those micro differences to what you have described or what you describe as significant difference leading to social change. And like the first stage, I thought as a historian, this is actually something, especially as an early modernist, that we hardly look at or can look at, because these are changes that we don't see. And I thought about work I did on merchant networks, where you have like from the social sciences on the theory of network theory, and then you look at your sources, and I can't see how often these people exchanged letters or how often they met. So I can, and how these practices or these interactions changed. So I hardly can trace this first stage. Nonetheless, I find it very appealing to use a concept like significant difference in relation to social change, and think about what happens when we look at practices, practice bundles, at chains of action and the material processes or conditions. So what I tried to do, as I said, thinking through it was another example. And because I liked your whiskey example, it was kind of funny because I immediately came up with two other examples involving the production of alcohol. So I thought at this hour we can stick to that. And first, I would like to take that to early modern Poland, when vodka making, which existed since the Middle Ages, but really became or moved to a new stage by the end of the 16th century, and increased dramatically when basically shipping grain to the Baltic Sea was not very efficient anymore. So what noblemen did, they just kept at least parts of the grain on their estates and turned it into a vodka, which they then sold, or they had Jews who were leaseholders for the production of alcohol, but also for the inns and selling of alcohol, and then sold it again to the peasants who just had harvested the grains, which I think is one of those or examples where you can see a lot of social change in many different ways. You have Jews increasingly serving as leaseholders for production and sale of alcohol, which bound them even more closely to the Polish nobility. The alcohol was, as I said, primarily sold to peasants on these estates, which created more revenues in forms of taxes for the nobility. So we see change in terms of economic processes, relations between peasants, Jews, and nobility, but also in consumption habits, which again emphasizes, and that's only part of it, the great degree of interconnectedness and complexity you also just mentioned. And the second example, which I won't go into, but because some of us were in Guadalajara in Mexico for summer school recently, we learned a lot about tequila making in Jalisco, which I thought was very interesting because also made from the agave plant. It was until a few years ago or a few decades ago, it was called mezcal and was basically booze for the poor. And turned over a few decades into an expensive commodity, which changed the production, the landscape dramatically, but also the social composition of society, consumption patterns, and which we can trace to all these different parameters you're talking about, like practices, processes, material conditions. And I won't go into detail with that. So what I was thinking about these examples, if we have, when we think about micro change, significant change, significant differences and social change, if there is another stage, and that's something I think we think a lot about in the SFB, if there's another stage, then we would call rather something like transformation, because coming back to the example from Poland, I think despite that we have significant differences and social change that occurred, it all occurred within a feudal system. So what we don't see here, like serfdom continued, and a lot of other legal conditions didn't change that dramatically. So I wonder if transformation would only be once we see a transition to a different economic system like capitalism, even so market practices occurred before. And so we have also, despite those changes, the persistence you just mentioned. But the question is, first, is there like another stage when we look from the perspective of historians that we might call transformations? And the other questions, and I think that's something you already talked about on Tuesday in the research class, if this relates, if we have those stages to something we talk about in the SFB in terms of the micro, meso, and macro level, if we can, at least to some extent, and I might be totally wrong here, to equate that to significant difference causing social change and transformation. So we do both like questions separately, right? So I would, that would be for my thoughts on the first question.
Do you want to maybe add to the first question and then we make a round of responses to that? Sure. After Tobias, should I continue? Just the first question.
Just the first question. Yes, I mean, just adding on to what Cornelia just said, it seems to me that significance lies very, or significant difference, whatever significant or not, and that's something that you already said at the beginning, and that you also write about change, that change very much is a matter of perspective and it's a contextual matter. And depending on who looks at change and in what context and compared to what, they will also consider the differences brought about by change as significant or not. I wonder whether significant change cannot occur on all different micro, meso, and macro levels. And that's something that we talked about on Tuesday, is that you are not very happy with this entire tripartite structure anyway. But yeah, so I do wonder whether significant difference can happen on a very small level as well as on a large level, whether the question of scale is really relevant to the question of significant difference. So that would be one question, but I do find very productive about the definition of change as you propose it as significant difference. For our particular purposes here at the SFB, is that it seems to me to be an inherently comparative idea, right? Because whatever is significant or not is only determined in comparison to something else. So my idea would be that significant difference always, when looking at change, always implies a temporal comparison. And I would be curious to know what you think about this, whether you would say that significant difference is an inherently comparative notion, or whether significance can also be thought about regardless of comparative actions or active comparison. So this would be my second question. And if I can formulate a third question, maybe leads away a little bit from the significant difference, but something that I'd be very curious about, and is also a question that we've been debating at the SFB in different contexts and situations, is how you think about the relation between social and historical change. Because your essay that we discussed on Tuesday, you have there's a quote passage where you say, well, social change in a way is always also historical change. And in our discussions here, I often find that we use those two different notions pretty much interchangeably. So we make a difference between social and historical change. But then I do wonder, is there not something like a different object or perhaps also subject of change, depending on whether we talk about social or historical change? And this might also then again relate to the question of significant difference. Do we think about significant difference in a different way when we talk about social change or when we talk about historical change? So that would be my third question.
Can you still take one more reply? Okay, Tobias, do you want to also give us your comments on the significant difference question?
Yeah, thanks. I can do that. First off, sorry for not being here. I would have loved to, but I got a cold. And as you might hear, I still have some flu-like symptoms and didn't want to bring them to you, to the group. Yeah, on the significant difference part, I found myself basically in agreement, I suppose. So I don't have to have much question here. I thought maybe you could also give a practical or pragmatic reasoning for doing this by saying we need to identify significant differences in order to be able to define our research question regarding change, right? We need to define what we find significant about the changes out there in the social world so that we find them deserving of doing research about it. So for instance, I could make a claim that, say, the practice of a round table isn't much changed whether you do it with 3 or 4 people. If you do it via Zoom or or in presence, and that might be debatable, especially maybe the second claim, but you have to make such claims in order to get started discussing and making research about social change. So in that regard, I found this kind of clarifying also with the distinction between fluctuation and change, right? Because then we'd say fluctuation is the occurrence of insignificant difference also over time. And that's also not always maybe easy to identify, but you have to try, right, to get started. So I found that quite clarifying, actually.
Thank you, Tobias. So maybe Ted, you want to?
Okay, there are a lot of things there. I'm afraid I forgot the question you formulated, but I liked the vodka example when you spelled out. Actually, I don't like bourbon. It's just, it's Kentucky is identified with bourbon, so I try to write about a different aspect of Kentucky in each of my books. So bourbon was just, but what I liked about the vodka is that I thought you nicely illustrated what I wanted to say, because you talked about how you told us a story, picking out significant differences that had occurred. And then you said in the context of, and that the implication was that in the context of the history of vodka, there were all kinds of changes. And yet, in the context of the history of economic systems, it didn't really amount to change. So that illustrated the idea that with the change of context, significance looks very different, and that something counts as change and not, even though as a matter of the facts, how were things becoming different at different moments, those were just whatever happened and yet one would tell a different story about what was changing in the two contexts. So I thought that worked very nicely. And I also appreciate philosophers don't have to worry about epistemology and methodology. So I appreciate your initial comment that, you know, getting at those constant differences is not possible. So I would say that one presumably has access to some of them. And then there's an art to sort of piecing together what you want to say then about them. But philosophers, I mean, that's not relevant to the philosopher who is free to invent, which is what I think philosophy is. It's invention. I think Gilles Deleuze said it right, you know, when he described philosophy as the creation of the plane of thought. And so it's spelling out the concepts in terms of which thinking can then occur. And that's a very creative in almost in an artistic sense. And so there is no responsibility to actually having to go do something then, and what the implications of the thought might be for that. All right, so Lisa, you asked a lot of good questions. Yes, difference and change can occur at all the different levels. And, you know, it's the questions you're asking in the project you're involved in about kind of where you are. But you're right, I also would not want to talk about the three levels. And as a substitute for that, I think small and large is a good place to start. And so you can have, you know, a person in their laboratory coming up with a technological innovation, which then, given what its effects are, how people react to it, in retrospect, qualifies as a change. It then has ramified outwards. Or you could look at large phenomena, such as certain sectors of the tech industry, and certainly there, you know, one can clearly differentiate as well. Now, the second one is the second issue about is comparison inherent to the determination significance. The question is whether juxtaposition and comparison are the same thing. Juxtaposition, comparison certainly is a form of juxtaposition, but it doesn't work the other way. And I'm not sure there. A juxtaposition, generally speaking, is created. So one would think there's at least an implicit comparison. So I'm not quite sure, but the two clearly are very similar in a lot of ways. So, social and historical change, this is, I mean, I'm not sure what to say about this, because what I want to say about it is philosophical. So we'll diverge from what maybe the historian wants to say about it. So for me, something is historical if it occurs, if it is something to do with time, something to do with people occurring in time. Okay, and so all social, anything is historical in that sense. Unless you believe there are syncretic structures out of time, but of course that was a popular way of thinking not that long ago. If there were such things. So that would suggest if you thought that structures could change, that might be a form of social change that's not historical change, because it does technically lie outside of time. But I tend to think that everything that has transpired, is thus has occurred in time. And so anything to do with human coexistence is in history and is ipso facto. Now, whether it works the other way around, that all historical change is social change, that then there are concepts of natural history, right? So if you complicate what it is that's changing, for instance, to include nature, or to try to talk in a way which doesn't work with any hard and fast distinction between nature and whatever's not nature, then one wouldn't go in the other direction. So then one would have reason to differentiate. And then the question would, what would history be if not passage through time? and you no longer have, are making human centered to what qualifies as history. Yeah, I like the fluctuation change. I think that caught a difference that's important, because fluctuation you could think is kind of back and forth change, right? It's change around a center in something, but that's missing something to insist that it's change, because in one sense it's not, but if you step back, nothing's really changing. Fluctuation, the whole idea of fluctuation is around a pole of some sort. And so unlike change, which moves in a direction and is maybe headed somewhere, that's not true with fluctuation. So that marks a difference, a way of accommodating constant difference, but contrasting it with change. So I do think that is a good juxtaposition. Also, you were talking, you were possibly introducing, and I was curious about what you thought about this, was two different senses of significance. Vis-a-vis, there's the significance that maybe qualifies differences as change, and then there may be another significance imposed with interpretation. And I'm not sure whether those need to be the same, or whether it's useful to separate them. Maybe it's wrong to separate them. And that even the all significance is interpretation all the way down, right? And so that that would suggest that there isn't any meaningful difference there. But what you said made me pose that as an issue to my mind. So so there's some responses. Thank you.
We have a second round because we had a second question, and then I want to have at least half an hour in the end to open the floor as well for your questions. So maybe we try to keep it a little shorter than you prepared. I'm sorry for that, but I want to have an opportunity for everyone to have. Connie, do you want to go first again?
And sorry for being
No
on the
worries.
first
No,
round.
that's
So concerning the second question, I again obviously thought about like concrete examples and much more thought about the projects we're working on in our project on the compared bodies within the SFB, because I think here questions of materiality in relation to chains of actions seem to me especially relevant when you think about how materiality changes. And I was thinking about the case of my Hebraists who write about Jews in the early modern period, and what changes like where we have things, for example, the accessibility to Hebrew. Like first you need converts to teach you Hebrew, then there are more and more works that are translated, more and more works of like printed books to teach you Hebrew, and eventually Christians who can teach you Hebrew, which takes out the converts out of the picture, which also changes then the change of actions that happen in producing ethnographic work in the from the 16th to the 18th century. And the same in terms of print, which obviously, when we think about materiality, is a very important component in this area, and how, for example, the change in the production of images from woodcuts or very not very precise to copper engravings change also other practices of description, practice of putting together books. And so I think in this way, it's very, very useful to really look at this interplay of chains of actions and the material events and processes that kind of interlock and interrelate with it. And the second example, where it's even when we really talk about materiality in the widest sense, where it's even more visible, is basically when we think about the body, and especially this is kind of more prevalent in Malte Wittmach's project, where we have travelers who describe in a very self-referential way their own bodies, but also material processes and contexts like air, food, temperature, and related very closely to their practices of writing, of comparing, of ordering material, also including their knowledge about the body, which again influences the practices of treating sickness, of eating and drinking. And so I think these are very nice examples and show how useful it is to really think about the mutual influence of materiality and chains of actions, but especially in our context of the SFB, of different practices and bundles of practices that include, among others, practices of comparing, which also maybe takes the discussion a bit more into this direction, and the practice theory, even so. That's not the main focus on the book. So I'm sure it is.
Thank you so much. Elisa?
Yes, I'll continue. I find the definition very convincing. That's what I would like to start with. And what I find so productive about it is that it helps to think conceptually about distributing agency of change to ontologically different, diverse entities, to humans, to different material entities, non-humans, other living beings. And as such, it is also it makes the definition for me as a literary scholar very accessible and very useful also, because of course we have human beings that write and come up with ideas and fictional worlds, but then the entire art complex only materializes in different material forms that then have their own dynamics of being that of course can also affect change. So in that sense, I find it very useful for us as well. And what you stress is not just humans, and it's much less single human individuals that generate change, but really a whole array of non-human and human and non-human entities and human entities together in different types of relations that then bring about change. I would like to ask one rather technical question that goes also back to the essay that we discussed on Tuesday, where there's a passage in which you discuss different practice theoretical approaches to conceptualizing the relation between practices or activity chains and materiality or material events and processes. And if I understood it correctly, I think we briefly touched upon this also in our discussion, but maybe you would like to elaborate more on this. If I understood it correctly, you argue to conceptually or analytically distinguish between practices and materiality, and in doing so, you go into, or you propose a different approach than other practice theories. And I would like to ask you if you could elaborate more on that. How do we actually do that, thinking of practices, conceptualizing practices as isolated from their material surroundings or their material realization? That's something that I'd be curious to hear more about.
Thank you. And Tobias, your thoughts on chains of actions?
Yeah, thanks. So I understood this question more in terms of what, from a sociological point of view, we could find interesting, inspiring about the theory of social change that is developed in the book, which of course is a very broad and multifaceted question. So I will focus on maybe 2 points. One where I really found it helpful, found the book helpful in pushing my own thinking forward, and that is this idea of overviews, where you argue that it's possible to use concepts like, say, industrialization, evolution, transformation, development, maybe even modernization, differentiation would be other candidates in the sociological canon. If we use them kind of with the awareness that they don't actually explain something, right? At least that's what I would take away from it. So we have to use them actually to tell a convincing or an adequate story that is adequate in the sense that it does justice to the complexity of the social world. But underlying is a ongoing bundling of practices that makes it possible and plausible to speak in these terms. And that is what explains change, right? I think that is a very important kind of also compromise, maybe we could say, about how to deal with these concepts. And it's actually quite similar to what we discussed with Wolfgang Knöbel a few months ago when he was here talking about große Prozessbegriffe. Right, many of these terms that you mentioned that use for overviews could also be described as große Prozessbegriffe in this tradition. They seem to have a similar function. And the problem, of course, is that many sociologists, at least, don't use it in this kind of modest fashion, but actually seem to think that they explain something with it. And I think that the challenge seems to be to combine their usage with a modesty that seems to be necessary to use them in a productive way. So, but the other remark I want to make is based on my interest in competition and an overall impression that I have. So that I'm interested in competition, at least for me, doesn't mean that I want to see competition everywhere. On the other hand, I am interested in when it occurs and then also in the causal effects and the changes it might affect, right? And against the background also of possible readings of the stories, say about that you tell, for instance, about the Kentucky bourbon industry, my impression was that your way of describing this is a very peaceful account, put it this way, or harmonious account of you could explain it very differently, and I guess a Bourdieuian would explain it much differently, would much more struggle be involved, like much more competition. And it actually reminded me of a reading experience I had in the sociology of arts when reading Howard Becker next to Pierre Bourdieu. Right, and I felt, well, the one it's just cooperation, collaboration, and that's the arts. And then there's just struggle, competition, that's the arts. And it's obvious that's kind of, they're exaggerating in different directions. It seems to be a description of the field of arts. Kind of obviously, it has to kind of have both in it, maybe a mixture or a balance, if you want. And so, my provocative question to you would be, is Theodore Schatzki a bit to Bourdieu on the level of theory, what Becker is to Bourdieu in the sociology of arts? That is, are you more focused on collaboration and cooperation, or is that just a maybe, heuristic effect or maybe even rhetorical effect of the cases that you use and what you found empirically there? And if that's not the case, and if you could say there is maybe a slight imbalance, then of course the question would be, how could we bring in more of struggle, conflict, maybe scarcities and their effects into the theory? What would be your ideas to actually do that? Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right, so let me pick up on that last point because after I had published an earlier book, a good friend of mine said to me, "Ted, where's the conflict?" I realized that indeed, I guess it's a reflection of my own political views, wanting harmony in the world, that I had written about things happening in the social world without sort of describing the conflict that was bound up with these. So I think at that point, I would say it was a heuristic at some point. And however, there is conflict in the story, but it's conflict and not competition. So what is, I think, missing from the story to some extent is what the economists would say is competition. But I think there's actually plenty of conflict in the book. Now, I do think it happens that the origins of Kentucky bourbon is a harmonious story. It's very similar to what you were saying about vodka and about like surplus grain, and what do you do with the surplus grain then? And in fact, it was kept local and used to produce alcohol for local people. So there was no market at that point. I mean, the only economic real transaction going on is that the distiller would trade with the local farmers or maybe the local blacksmith. They would just trade, they would just barter things. And the bartering was restricted to the locale. And this is a facet of the type of expansion with European movement to westwards in North America. It's been written about how you had these little multiple centers that opened up. And at first these were in fact somewhat economically distinct. And I think it is a harm. Now, of course, there's endless interpersonal conflict that enters in any context of human life, but that's not terribly significant for the story. So competition, the only economic, I think there is more to be said here. I think, however, I'd have to think more about the question at a deeper level about whether, in fact, I believe you can tell the story absent that economic competition, except insofar as comparison occurs, and that once bourbon had become part of the story is about the way it was first an agricultural pursuit, and then it's industrialized. And once it becomes industrialized, which is tied to more expansive transportation networks, then you get what the economists are going to start calling competition. But one could read the story as one can tell the story as still one of activity change in material process where people are comparing. Because pricing, of course, I mean, you can theorize pricing as simply local comparisons, or the comparison with greater, better communication and information gathering, the comparison maybe the scope of the comparison becomes larger. And so then competition would enter, for instance, in the types of comparisons that are made to affect pricing. And for example, in the type of product choices and wheeling dealing that then occurs through negotiation to determine what a person actually purchases. And so that then becomes the cash value of what competition is. So I'm talking a little bit off the top of my head here. And so competition does not become this structural, graphable model of things, but lies in these particular practices and moments of practices that start developing with better transportation and better information networks. So, but that's not something I've thought much about. So that's a little bit off the cuff answer. Also, I wanted to make, in response to your earlier comments, and for instance, the use of the word industrialization, and that we use these concepts in a non-explanatory way. They're in this context have to differentiate between two types of concepts. There are concepts for the social entities that exist. And I would take industrialization to be an example of that. It captures a generically kind of process that takes on endless specific over a certain period of time. Then there are concepts we use to give an overview of the action chains and material processes that are responsible for the existence of those social entities. And I thought the concepts I was giving fell into the second class. And so we would talk about industrialization. And of course, that sums up a tremendous complexity to talk about people, but people talk that way and they communicate tremendously in a social science context. So I'll talk what were the causes of industrialization? And then, whatever I say, those other concepts maybe become useful in explaining how industrialization and which ones then depends on your account of of the phenomenon. So we need to differentiate a little bit among the concept used in overviews to you might say produce digestible chunks of understanding. Use the word, I like the word chunk. It was used was it I guess yesterday in the Domino lecture. It's a great word, chunk. Yeah, and but there's a certain chunk of understanding that gets formulated as industrialization was caused by such and such. Because if you think about the reality of the social world, there's an incredible gulf there. And yet our understanding travels and is formulated with these concepts. And it's typically the social scientists who are either historians or historical members of their discipline that then get down much more into that nitty-gritty, right? And then finally one sees that understanding conveyed at that large level is, well, there are a lot of asterisks. There's a lot of nuance that has to be added. It might be downright misleading, to put it that way. And so that gets filled in. So, okay, so I'm going on a little bit here. But okay, I'll go backwards. Elisa, so the way you put it raises a good, interesting issue. You said that, when you bring in materiality, we're spreading agency. Well, I kind of actually object to that way of talking. I think what we're doing is recognizing that causality is plural, that there are different types of causality in the world that are associated with different entities. So we could bring animals in, something that's not in the book very much. It's a lacuna in the book that there isn't more discussion of animals, because what one wants to say about animals and different types of animals, is very different than what one wants to say about thunderstorms, or what one wants to say, to bring another contemporary example, artificial intelligence. That the types of causality that are different here. So we need to recognize a multiplicity of causalities, and human agency is just one of them. And so I would put the point differently, because I really would prefer, we gotta keep some word for what humans do. Because what humans do is a paradigm starting from which much of our understanding about how other things in the world work is constructed. And so, for instance, our understanding of animals, I believe, is entirely a matter of moving from our self-understanding to strip away, to figure out what are they doing? How do we understand it? We do them as all modeled as somehow stripped down models of us. And then, of course, there are then dolphins, where, well, no, it's not very stripped down, it seems. And then we've got aliens who we aren't going to know what to do with conceptually unless they, of course, decide to treat us the same way, and thereby enable communication. So I want to retain some word, and so I like keeping the word agency.
For humans.
For the human type of intentional, self-conscious causality, that is being responsible for things. So we are responsible for changes in the world in an intentional, self-conscious way. And maybe dolphins are. Who knows what we're going to say about robots in 5 years? But so the multiplicity comes in with the notion of causality, not by acknowledging multiplicity of objects as, to talk Latour language, doers, which just strips away all the detail and in fact strips away all the differences. He's the ultimate leveler, even though it's in the name of recognizing difference that he makes all the claims about doing. So, and you asked for, should I keep going on?
2 minutes.
Okay, so you asked for clarification for practices and materiality. And there is a divide among practice theorists about whether material entities are part of the practices or intimately bundled with them. And there's a lot I could say about that, but the view which I represent, which is they're intimately bundled, is not a view of isolation or separation. They're very tightly knit together in ways one wants to view. But I do think one doesn't want to build them into the practices. I think that one needs a way of talking, for instance, about how you can have fragmentation of material arrangements and that then get taken up in the practices differentially. And so that different practices then maybe get carried out in the same material settings, and one can handle those types of phenomena better. Building them in sort of leads to some funny ways of talking. And then the body, I mean, the human body for philosophers has always been a mystery, and in a conceptual kind of way, not in other sorts of ways, because the two different registers come together in the human body, right? Activity and material causality come together, and philosophers have long struggled with how to, how to capture conceptually that coming together of these two registers. And not that they may not come together elsewhere, but they come together in our experience. And so philosophers have long and so it makes the body particularly interesting on these kinds of issues. And of course, as one learns more about the body, it just becomes that much more interesting. All right, so thank you.
Thank you so much.